Hi, my name is Brad Blackwell. I'm a research wildlife biologist with USDA's National Wildlife Research Center. My colleague and collaborator with this presentation is Esteban Fernandez, Hulisic, Department of Biological Sciences, Purdue University. In this short presentation, we'll introduce opportunities for behavioral research to mitigate avian mortality at solar energy facilities. Our presentation is a part of the ABS Conservation Committee workshops. This will occur at Behavior 2019, which is a joint meeting between the International Council of Ethologists and the annual conference for the Animal Behavior Society. The meeting will be held between July 23 and 28, 2019 at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Now, incorporating behavioral principles into conservation, we need to ask some initial questions. What's the context of the conservation problem? What species are involved? Who are the players? What's the legal, cultural, and economic background? What's understood? What remains to be learned? And what do we understand about the ecology of the species associated with the conservation issue? How does ecological and behavioral theory inform a particular conservation issue? In this case, we'll use habitat selection as our example. Now, our approach will be to look at the problem from the perspective of solar facility types, bird mortality. Then we'll look at animal selection of resources, again using habitat selection as our example. Here we'll look at decision-making based on their data. And what I mean is the data that the birds perceive from the facility as well as the environment and how that feeds into decision-making. With this brief introduction, we'll touch on undetected or underestimated risks, anthropogenic changes to the habitat, again broadly speaking. We'll also introduce the role of sensory ecology. Birds are visual animals, so visual cues coming from the facility and the surrounding habitat will be important in decision making, their ultimate behavior, and then the individual's fitness. This will bring us to mitigation. What do we know? What do we need to understand? Facility types. First, we have linear concentrating systems, which include parabolic troughs and linear Fresnel reflectors. Now, these systems, as can be seen from the photograph, reflect the sun's energy. There's another system where that energy is then conducted, stored elsewhere, and converted to electric energy. We have a unique system that is a solar power tower. Here we have arrays of reflective mirrors that track the sun's light throughout the day. The light is reflected on the tower itself, and there that heat energy is stored or used in the process of developing electric output elsewhere. Now, what's unique about this particular system is that the energy reflected onto the power tower creates a high energy airspace around the tower, and as birds move through that airspace, they can be incinerated or burned badly. There are also solar dishes or engines, and here we have arrays of many thousands of small mirrors that then reflect the light on other systems within that major array, and that energy is converted to electricity. Photovoltaic systems, again, arrays on large acreages, and here we have semiconductor materials within the array that receive the solar energy from the sun. That energy is then converted via photovoltaic effect into electricity, and electricity is either conducted elsewhere on site or stored. Now, problems with these facilities, there's misinterpretation of sensory cues or lack of sensory information altogether from a bird's perspective. There's direct mortality due to grounding. This involves birds and bats. And there's also the solar flux, which we discussed with the solar power towers. There's indirect mortality, the inability to escape after grounding. This involves some water bird species. Collision or heat injuries and subsequent predation. And then the facility footprint itself, the habitat loss associated with land and water, barrier effects, and noise. And then these facilities can actually enhance prey concentrations. For example, insects and small mammals may react to the microenvironment associated with heat and light or even cover. And then we have the carcasses on the facility from the kills. These can create food and actual prey resources, which can lure birds into the site and create, in some cases, an ecological trap. So what do we know? We know that mortalities across taxa as well as diversity of taxa affected are uncertain. We know that direct mortality via impact trauma and exposure to concentrated solar energy and heat is prevalent at the solar power tower facilities. We know that there's indirect mortality due to injury and subsequent predation. habitat fragmentation and loss, and disturbance. And when mortalities occur, this varies by species, and the ambient conditions affecting those species and the mortality rates remain uncertain. It's also important when we're asking questions about a particular facility to understand the seasonal effects, the time of day effects, and wind and temperature, and perhaps other ambient factors at the site. Also, why birds use these facilities is not necessarily obvious. We do not want our conclusions to be necessarily correlational. They should be objective and founded upon hypothesis-driven research. As an example, there is a lake effect hypothesis that's common now. This has to do with the possibility that the structural surface of a facility visually mimics water, lures birds in, and they are grounded. Now, a premise of the lake effect hypothesis is that birds can detect polarized light. And I'll say now that this is highly controversial in the literature, and I encourage you to go back and look at these papers and look at the debate that's ongoing on this particular hypothesis. There's also the availability of cover and water, even predator avoidance, or the ambient conditions that favor increased prey concentrations and thus lure birds into the facility. So what's the role of ecological behavioral theory relative to the conservation issue? In this case, we're going to look at habitat selection. Now, selection of habitat should strongly influence an individual's fitness. Biotic and abiotic effects on individual fitness will vary with space and time. And we know that animals are not all-knowing, so selecting the best habitat will depend upon prior experience, the age, the sex of the species or the animal, and the information exchanged with conspecifics and other species, and then innate capacity such as sensory feedback. Also, habitat selection, given our changes to the environment, can demand some level of plasticity with regard to resource use, tolerance of disturbance, and even dealing with perceived risk. So we're going to work toward mitigation. We first need to work on developing hypotheses. Here's some examples. Species X is responding to enhanced prey concentrations, but the foraging strategy exposes individuals to collision risk. Or Species X takes advantage of structural cover at the site, but is also subject to solar energy exposure. Perhaps Species X misinterprets visual cues from the parabolic troughs or other structures, and as a result, there's direct collision mortality or injury. To summarize, the context of the conservation problem is important. What's the facility type? What's the background of the problem from an economic and cultural and perhaps even a legal perspective? What's the ecology of the species that's associated with this particular conservation issue? What's known about injuries and mortalities? And can we develop testable hypotheses based on this information that we've gleaned in our initial inquiry? This is important. So with that, I'll leave you with some related literature that helped us in developing this brief presentation. I thank you for your time, and I hopefully will see you at Behavior 2019.